Is Israel about to occupy Gaza? Leaks from the Prime Minister's office suggest a major operation is on the table, but tensions are rising between Netanyahu and IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir, who warns it could endanger the hostages. Is it a trial balloon or a real plan? Meanwhile, U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson's visit to Judea and Samaria raises questions. Could annexation be next?
Shalom, I'm Mark Regev, and welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. And of course, as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Bloom. Good morning, Ruthie.
Good morning, Mark. Listen, before we get to real serious topics, I would like to stop for a second and really thank all our viewers who have been writing to our email, undiplomatic@jns.org, for your comments and your questions, which we are trying every week to incorporate into our discussions, and this week is no exception. And also to, again, thank all of you who have been liking and subscribing to our content. And now we're going to get to the content. The world has been reporting since yesterday or the day before that, based on anonymous sources, may I say, that Prime Minister Netanyahu is planning on, in the next cabinet meeting, the cabinet will decide to occupy Gaza completely after all these negotiations with Hamas failed, of course, and after these horrific videos of two hostages who are being purposely starved and tortured. One of them is digging his own grave in the tunnels. And after a whole media blitz around the world that Israel has been starving Palestinians on purpose. So the idea now Netanyahu did not confirm or deny this report about this move.
So you said the international media has been reporting about this, but about the possible Israeli invasion and aggressive intention towards Gaza.
Occupation is the word being used by everybody.
So I would say they are reporting, I'd put an adjective before that. They are reporting with concern, with fear. They are worried. I've heard reports from media in Canada, the United States, Australia, where they're saying, well, now there's going to be this, instead of finishing the war, there's going to be this terrible escalation with the cost of human life. And what do these crazy Israelis think they're doing? Instead of winding this down, they are winding this up. That's the criticism.
One second. It's not concern and fear. It is outright hostility based on the word occupation. And it isn't just because the loss of human life. It is, with the help of the Israeli media, an assault on the Israeli government for listening to its most right-wing elements, etc. It's an assault. It's not concern. That's baloney. It is an out-and-out assault. And as I said, aided and abetted happily by Israeli journalists.
So I stand by what I said because that's the way it sounded to me. But I would say the following, and my understanding of the situation is that Netanyahu did not want to get to where we are now, that he honestly tried to get a deal through the Americans, through Mr. Witkoff and the other members of the Trump team who were very much involved in the negotiations with the mediators and directly with Hamas to try to get a ceasefire hostage release deal. And it's clear to me from the reporting and from what the Americans said publicly that Netanyahu, to use the American expression, was willing to go the extra mile to show flexibility in these talks to get the ceasefire and the hostage release. That's what his preference was. That's what he wanted to do. But Hamas torpedoed those talks. Hamas came back with these ridiculous positions, even hardening the positions. And the Americans, in the end, publicly throw up their arms and say Hamas doesn't want a deal. Not Israel said so. The United States said so when they were there in the thick of things, like the French and the British and the Australians and the Canadians. They can say whatever they want, but they're the I say they show the ire of the irresponsible or the ire of the impotent because they're not involved in these talks. They're bystanders. They're onlookers. They don't know what's going on. The Americans do know what's going on, and they pointed the finger at Hamas. And then the dilemma for the government of Israel is what to do in a situation. Your first priority was try to get this deal. Hamas has made that, unfortunately, as far as we know, as far as we can see, they've made the option of a negotiated deal to get hostages out and achieve a ceasefire. That's off the table today. So what does Israel do in the absence of the possibility of a deal that gets hostages out and creates a ceasefire? You've got two choices as far as I can see it. Choice number one is to capitulate to all of Hamas's demands, which is not an option. I'm sorry, it's just not a serious option. And the other option is you have to upgrade the military. You have to go in there and you have to continue doing what we're doing. And even, as I say, upgrade it, make Hamas pay and to slowly but surely take over more of the Gaza Strip. At the moment, we control 75% of the Gaza Strip, take over the latter. Those areas where Hamas still has strongholds, those areas where Hamas still controls on the ground, where their leadership is, where their forces are. And we have to continue the operation against them. Now, I don't think it was our first choice, but if that choice has been forced upon Israel, we have to go down that road.
Well, in retrospect, it probably should have been our first choice, but that's another discussion. There is the following issue. It isn't just that we were flexible, okay? And here I would really like to criticize the Netanyahu government for giving in to many demands without getting a single hostage released, without even getting the Red Cross to visit the hostages, not one thing in exchange for the tons of aid that's going in there, food, medicine, etc. We haven't gotten anything in exchange for weeks of allowing Hamas to get away with staying in power. Now, another thing I think people don't realize is that really Hamas has been almost completely defeated. Of course, it has leaders sitting in Qatar in five-star hotel conditions, but Hamas on the ground in Gaza is virtually destroyed. But as long as there's even one person calling himself the leader, and as long as there are 20 live hostages and 30 dead bodies in there, they can just continue. They know, and this is because they're a death cult terrorist organization, that all they need is a vestige of their group, and they've won. How do they know that? Because they have our hostages, and they know that Israelis care about each human life. They don't care about their own human life, their own population. They want them to starve and be dead and be killed in airstrikes, and they also want Israelis killed. So all they need to do is survive by the skin of their teeth. And when I say they, you can't even name me we've already killed all the commanders, most of them, and the heads of the battalions, etc. So here, the last problem is the hostages. And what I have heard, and again, nobody knows for sure. You and I are not behind the scenes, and neither is this journalist, that journalist. There are leaks, etc. But one thing I did hear, and it sounds reasonable to me or plausible, is that we do know where the hostages are being held, not just the area, but many of them we actually know where they're being held, because all throughout the war we're saying, why don't we know where they are? How can we kill a Hamas commander in Tehran and we don't know where our hostages is, right? Our hostages are, they're so close physically to where we are. So apparently we do, for the most part. But we also know, as Hamas has threatened, and we believe it because they already proved this is true, that if they hear IDF soldiers approaching in any fashion, approaching the hostages, they'll execute them. And we saw that happen last year with 6 hostages who were executed in cold blood. And so we don't want that to happen. So what I understand is that another policy we are going to try to implement is getting directly to the captors individually somehow. I don't know how, because again, I don't understand anything about the military on the ground, the operations. But to get to them directly, it could be to bribe them, threaten them, whatever it takes. And that seems to be the most, I would say, realistic approach right now to save them. And having said that, I'm going to make one more point, and that is that we know that they're in danger. We know they're being purposely starved by captors who have food that they stole from UN aid trucks and etc. We know that the captors have food. We know they're purposely starving and torturing those hostages. So we know they're at death's door. And we also know that any move we make right now, and that includes, by the way, any deals with Hamas, that they are in danger, that we are putting them at greater risk, but there's no choice. And I am not saying I say that with heartbreak, of course, but there is no choice.
We actually heard from a hostage who reported, it was in the media. He said he was in a room given half a piece of pita bread a day to eat and in a state of semi-starvation. And he looked at his captors and they were eating fresh fruit. I think he even said bananas and meat and all this stuff that was coming in that the Hamas was stealing from the aid. And that's just the reality of Gaza. Hamas controls the flow of aid and they make sure that their people get most of it. And I think they've also deliberately cultivated this crisis in Gaza for political reasons. And now I want to go to the following question. Why is it that against all logic, when everyone thought that a hostage deal was going to be very, very close, did Hamas move away? So one answer you gave, and it's true, is that they're crazy. They're like ISIS. They're a death cult and they don't, that's who we're dealing with.
Not crazy, ideological, Islamist,
extremist.
jihadist.
Okay, we're not arguing.
Extremist is a mild term.
Okay. But there are other reasons as well. Because they know that they're losing this militarily. They're not idiots. They're extremists. They're bloodthirsty killers, but they're not stupid. And they know they're losing this militarily. But they think, unfortunately, because of two factors, that if they just bite their lip and hold out in the end, they can win this. Factor number one is that they know how dear the hostage issue is for the Israeli people, not just for the families, but for all Israelis. And in the end, they keep up the pressure and Israel will capitulate, agree to the Hamas demands, which means Hamas stays in power and retakes over the whole Gaza Strip and starts preparing for the next October 7th. Because we are so desperate, we will pay any price to get the last hostage out. And there are enough voices in Israel who echo that can give Hamas the feeling, why should they compromise? And that Israel in the end will agree to their terms because we value the lives of the hostages, and we do. And if Hamas believes that that's about to happen, maybe another week, maybe 10 days, why should they compromise? Number two, and here I want to go back to what I said before. I said before, the ire of the impotent, the French and the British and the Canadians and the Australians and the European Union, all these people, right, who are saying, stop the war now. And that's, they're taking, how do you say, what would be a good metaphor?
They mean lose the war.
No, but they mean stop the war now means Hamas stays in power. They don't have to worry about Israel. And they think if it's not going to be internal pressure on Israel because of our desire to get the hostages out, it's the international pressure on Israel because all these governments are saying stop the war. In the end, Israel will be forced theoretically by these international elements to stop the war. And so actually, I would say to those international leaders, whether it's Macron or Starmer or the Carney in Canada or the Australian Prime Minister, all these people have been calling for a immediate ceasefire, right? You've actually undermined the chances of a ceasefire that could have been achieved through the release of hostages because you have helped entrenched Hamas's hardline position that torpedoed any chance of a ceasefire.
And you're absolutely right. And also, let me just say, there's also a cynical aspect to this because as you pointed out last week, I think it was, that these leaders in Europe are concerned with their constituents. They have a growing radical Islamist population. Not all the Muslims in Europe are radical Islamists, but they do have a growing radicalization. By the way, as is the case in America, Europe, and elsewhere, that the left is growing more radical and backs the Islamists. So they're concerned, but the irony is on that the joke is on them because they think of everything as like, this is all Israel, it's all over there. They don't realize that they're facing similar threats. They're seeing it in individual terrorist attacks and stuff. But, while they're saying, oh, well, we have to cater, you call that political reasons. I'm saying that they don't know what's waiting for them. That's number one. Number two, nobody, and the Israeli left also, they're just disgusting. The artists, all these petitions being signed saying, it's not just they're saying, stop the war. They're also buying into Hamas's narrative about Israel's being the bad guy already. And there are petitions going around, academics, artists, singers, writers, the usual suspects. But here's the thing. They keep saying that if we just end the war, we'll get all the hostages out. And where they have developed this ridiculous fantasy, there is no such deal on the table. But I will tell you one ironic thing about this. Months ago, there was a left-wing podcast in Hebrew, an Israeli podcast, and the interviewer said, "Okay, we all say at any price, end the war at any price, get the hostages home at any price." And so the interviewer said, "Okay, but what if the price is keeping Netanyahu at the helm for another 5 or 10 years?" And the other person said, "Oh, I wish you don't ask me that. That's hard to answer." In other words, let's endanger the whole of Israel by releasing bloodthirsty terrorists from prison, by anything Hamas wants. But to get all the hostages, you need to keep Netanyahu in power, then they have to think about it.
Well, first of all, as far as I know, Hamas has made no such request,
No,
yes, for
no,
obvious reasons.
no.
But I want to make clear, because if you poll the Israeli public, and of course polls can be biased, and it's not a science that is without problems. But if you ask the Israeli public in polls and you say stop the war and get all the hostages out, you get a clear majority in consecutive polls. The minute, however, you articulate what Hamas's demands are, then suddenly that majority dissipates. And let's be clear what Hamas is demanding. Hamas is, and I leave open the question, would they actually ever release all the hostages? Because I think that's a very doubtful proposition. Why would they in any way, from their point of view, the hostages are their assets. Why would they give them all up? But let's presume, for the sake of argument, that they would be willing to give back all the hostages. They are demanding in return, number one, a full and complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, which includes the perimeter area right next to the civilian communities, right? Which even people on the Israeli left, and I've seen interviews over the last few days, they say, do you agree to that? I don't agree to that. Well, Hamas isn't going to, that's fine. They say, not terrorists who've been in Israeli jails for years, the Nukba terrorists who beheaded, who raped, who burnt people alive on October 7th, those people who were deliberately and directly involved in the atrocities and the massacres of October 7th, they all have to be released. That's also a Hamas demand.
And,
yes.
And even in this latest incarnation of Hamas's demands, they demand not only to stay in power, not only that Israel withdraw, and not only that all the terrorists be released, but that they will release the hostages in stages depending on how well Gaza is rebuilt. So it could take years to release all the hostages. In other words, there is, as you said, even the Israeli left says, So, and the polls, here's another thing. Again, we know that. It all depends on the polling questions.
Correct.
But there's a mixture. Some people in Israel have a fantasy that if we just do this and that, then we'll get all the hostages. Others have ill will. And I know you seem to take issue with me on that, but I don't, okay? Because I read the wording of these Israelis who would rather the country go down the tubes than have not their own leftists in power here. And all you have to do is read the wording of their petitions and read what they say. And they say hostages, but let me tell you something. If that's what you call caring about the hostages, well, I say baloney. Okay, I would prefer a different word, but I'm afraid it'll get bleeped out.
So I want to take issue here. I understand, yes, there are people who don't like the government, and they used to attack the government on the judicial reform, or they attack the government for corruption or supposed corruption, and now they're attacking the government on hostages. I understand that's politics. Okay. I do believe, however, that there are many sincere Israelis who look at the hostage families and say, okay, to get their loved ones out, like with Gilad Shalit, yeah, we feel for these people, we have to go the extra mile. Let's just get these people out, and then we'll worry about Hamas afterwards. Some of them will even say, let's get the deal with Hamas, get all the hostages out, and then we'll go back in and get our vengeance and take care of Hamas then. Now, I mean, that's said a lot in Israel. Now, I can understand the emotions behind it. I don't think necessarily everyone who says that is evil, but they're wrong. They're wrong. There isn't an option that you're going to get all the hostages out and then you can go back the next day. That option is not there. There's not an option that says you can leave the Gaza Strip, go back to the October 6th frontier, and then suddenly go back into Gaza. It's not that easy. And people have to understand that.
Right. By the way, the far left in Israel doesn't even say that. What you said is more like, okay, the naive, it's the people who really do care, and they think, okay, let's just save them, and then we'll go back in and kill everybody we need to kill. All right? The hard left here, and by the way, they're gaining traction in the opposition. The way the Democratic Party in America has become more radical, in Israel, the left has become more radical. I'm talking about certain parties, like the merger of the Labor Party with Meretz has become far more radical than the left used to be here. So I'm talking about them. They don't say, okay, let's just get the hostages out and then kill everybody we need to. No, they say, let's have a two-state solution. Let's get out. They say things that are from the mentality of the failed Oslo Accords, the failed disengagement, the October 6th mentality, all the attempts that Israel has made at peace from forever since our existence, and they just are back. They just keep
can I argue?
pounding it.
I want to argue fiercely with you now.
Okay,
Ruki.
go
I
ahead.
think you got things very wrong, because I think anyone looking at the Israeli body politic, yes, has to see that where is the real interesting change? That Ruthie Bloom opposes a two-state solution. We can all yawn. That's been your consistent position for the last 20 years.
20?
More. I didn't want to expose your age to all our visitors, all right? All our viewers.
Forever.
Forever. But, okay, forever. What has happened over the last few years, and especially since October 7th, that most of the people who used to talk about a two-state solution in Israel, in other words, that, people like Yair Lapid, people in the Labour Party and so forth, they don't want to say those words today. They'll say it's not the right time. They don't say they're against it, but it's not the right time.
Right. You're right.
I remember,
You're right.
even in the last election, I remember leaving my house, true story, and at the traffic light on the intersection, there were people from Meretz, the left, Zionist left, handing out red roses because they, that's the symbol of their party. They're on the left.
Red, appropriate.
Red, and they gave me a piece of paper with 10 reasons why I should vote for Meretz, and one of them was because we should be against religious coercion and to throw Netanyahu out and corruption and all their issues, right? Not once did they mention a Palestinian state. And I would say to all those people around the world, whether it's Keir Starmer in London or Macron in Paris or Mr. Carney in Canada, all these people who talk about a two-state solution, you've got a problem here. Forget Ruthie Bloom and those members of the Israeli right who never supported a two-state solution. If the Israeli left doesn't want to talk about it, I'm not talking about a few people on the extreme ultra, yeah, but if mainstream Israeli left, is that a contradiction in terms? If the leadership in the Knesset of the opposition refuses to talk about a two-state solution, you have to ask them why. The people who were behind Oslo, who embraced Oslo, they don't want today to talk about a two-state solution. It's because Israelis understand that a Palestinian state means today a state that Israel will be attacked from.
Yes and no. First of all, you're absolutely right. They, in the last election campaign,
Yeah.
hid that aspect of their platform.
And in the past, they used to
No,
proudly
right.
espouse it.
And you're right that means that they know that voters, they'll lose voters if they do that. And that's a good sign. But what you're missing is that now, with the talk, now we're going to get to this talk about Judea and Samaria and annexation. We'll get to that. And the word occupation of Gaza. I'm hearing from mainstream liberals, not the hard left now. I heard this yesterday in a debate with someone who's not on the far left at all, saying, I'm sorry, we can't be both a Jewish and democratic state if we rule over all the Palestinians or whatever. He said that's the old line from all the people saying, no, it's not that. It's that we have to. And I'm saying, I can't believe I'm hearing this. Okay. I cannot believe I'm hearing the tired old mantras. Okay. Got to change. We like to say, we got to change the disk in the computer. Got to change the thinking. So I'm concerned about that because talk of that has come up again. And I'm going to just preface that and hand it over to you by saying that House Speaker Mike Johnson, on his visit to Israel this week, he was the highest American official to visit Judea and Samaria on an official trip. And he went there, and in his speech, he basically said, this area belongs by right to the Jews and to Israel. And with the backdrop of 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, the Knesset voted overwhelmingly in favor of annexing Judea and Samaria, or at least most of it, where most of the Jews are, et cetera, and also other places. So his statement has aroused all kinds of hysteria, but it has brought back that discussion about how can we do that and rule over all this, rule over. And I say, I'm sorry, it wasn't our choice to live by the sword. Never has it been our choice. And you got to wake up, okay? Because it's not just Hamas. The Palestinian Authority is just as bad. And what all of them say is, we will commit October 7th again and again and again and again, and we will wear down those humanitarian Jews. And it's succeeding because look at them. They're at odds with each other, and it's working.
So the issue came up in the past, in the previous government, the idea of annexation. And I remember saying at the time, the idea originally came from the Labour Party. After the Six-Day War, there was an Israeli senior Labour official in the government. He was foreign minister, a man called Yigal Allon, who talked about a situation where Israel would annex and keep as a permanent part of Israel areas of the West Bank essential basically for Israeli security. He talked about the Jordan Valley and the parts of the high ground and areas where Jewish people have a tradition. And there'd be some sort of territorial compromise, but that we would keep part of it. Dayan and Perez at the time, though Perez changed his positions, talked about that we'd need to keep the whole territory and that they could be citizens, or there'd be some sort of autonomy, or they could be citizens of Jordan or something like that. But the idea that Israel would remain there actually came from the Labour governments of Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir. It was an official Labour Party policy for a while, right? That there'd be some sort of territorial compromise. We would annex part and the Arab side would get the other part in the framework of peace. There are two questions.
That word peace. It's just so horrible.
But I'm saying
every time the word peace comes up,
you have
more blood is spilled.
Okay, but let me get back now to my point, which I want to say. First of all, there are two considerations that the Israeli government also needs to keep in mind. Number one, Israel is facing today, because of the fighting in Gaza, because of the war, we are facing staunch international criticism. And we have to ask ourselves, maybe it couldn't get worse, and so this is a time to do something we always wanted to do. Or we could say we don't want to put more wood on the fire or pour oil on the fire, choose your metaphor. And that's a decision that has to be looked at for those reasons. And okay. Second point on this issue, and let's be clear, we will not do it unless we get the backing of the United States. And here are the discussions we have, and that's why maybe the visit of the U.S. House Speaker is important. But ultimately, it'll be the call of the U.S. president. And I don't see an Israeli government doing it without a green light or a yellow light or between yellow and green from the White House. Because just to do it and have it not recognized by anyone is probably not a smart thing to do. You would need to have understandings reached with the
Right.
Americans.
Well, this
But
is
finally, what could force Israel to move this? What could be the game changer? If these governments in Europe say, we're going to give what we think is final status. There has to be a two-state solution on the 67 borders. We're going to recognize a Palestinian state, which means we upgrade the PA, which refuses to condemn October 7th and pays terrorists and pay for slay, yes, and that is riddled with corruption and which teaches its young people to hate Israelis and to kill Jews, yes. If we're going to upgrade, excuse me, we're going to upgrade their status to a country. And instead of having some unofficial French representative, he'll now be the ambassador to the state of Palestine. And Israel needs to respond. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people in the Israeli government who will say, okay, you do that. That's your attitude about final status. This is our attitude, and to annex certain areas. And so they could force Israel to a situation where we feel we have to respond.
right. Well, by the way, I do agree with you that it's not likely that we'll make such a move without the approval of the United States. But that's why we're in kind of a hurry, because Trump, though this is his second term, skipping one with the Biden administration in his first term, he said, great, recognize the Golan Heights, sovereignty over the Golan Heights, Israeli, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's ever a chance to get this done, it's during this term of President Trump. And I agree with you that we won't just do it. But there are good signs, because it's not just that House Speaker Mike Johnson was there, but also Ambassador Mike Huckabee, who has been very clear about Israeli rights, Jewish rights to the land of Israel. Now, so I don't know if we're going to do that, but I'll tell you what is true. That the world saying that the Palestinians need a state, or that's what their aim is ridiculous. They've never really aimed for a state, because we know this, because they kept refusing it. I mean, they've refused it since Palestine since the state of Israel was established. They've refused to share the land with us. And they could have had a state a million times over. And naive Israelis thinking that's what we all want. We all want the same thing. We just want our children to have a good life, etc. Well, it's not true in their case. And we found it out again and again. I always knew that, but okay, not just me. I'm not taking credit for knowing that. I was among the camp that always felt that. But they don't want a state. And by the way, when we withdrew and yanked every last Jew out of Gaza, okay? Where they had planted trees and
20
nice
years ago this week.
20 years ago, we also had to take dig up graves and take bones back out of there, because we knew they would desecrate them, and they did. All they did, instead of building a mini state in Gaza, where with all their billions of dollars and euros and shekels, what did they do? Destroyed all the greenhouses, built terror tunnels and missile factories. They didn't want a state, and they don't. And neither does, and the one who really doesn't want a state is the head of the Palestinian Authority, and that is Mahmoud Abbas. And how do we know that? Because it is only his supposedly striving for statehood that has kept him relevant and not assassinated all these years, and given him standing ovations at the disgusting United Nations. Having a state would mean having responsibilities. It means actually taking care of
Taking out the garbage.
And they don't want that. They want to kill Jews. They want to eliminate the state of Israel. It's about time. And as I said, anybody who's on their side has to ask himself if maybe that's his goal too.
I would also ask all these people, these Europeans and others who support these ideas. I would say, when Israel did pull back to the 67 borders, when Israel did take down settlements and force settlers to leave, did we get peace? And the example is, as I said a moment ago, 20 years ago in Gaza. And I would say to you, we saw how that turned out. And yet you want Israel
Yeah.
to do it. Excuse me. You want Israel to do that again? Hello? You have to be able to convince the Israeli public that doing it again is not going to be a repeat. And here I think the onus is on friends of the Palestinians, so-called friends, to tell Israel, you pull back and take down settlements. It's not going to be like Gaza. Well, why is it not going to be like Gaza? And here I want to take up what you said and put meat on the bones. When you say the Palestinians, were offered a state and they never said yes, they're happy to take a state instead of Israel, but not a state that will live in peace with Israel. Let's go through the history. In the 1930s, under the British mandate, the PL partition proposals, we didn't like the borders we were offered, but we said yes. Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, the Zionist leadership, said yes to a two-state solution. The Palestinians who were offered 2/3 of the land. No. All or nothing.
By the way, Arabs. Okay, because we were all Palestinians. It
correct.
was Palestine. The land of Israel was called Palestine.
Correct. 47 partition proposal, same thing. All or nothing. We accepted the borders. They danced in the streets of Tel Aviv after the partition resolution in November 1947. They declared war on us. So you had two chances before the state of Israel was established to have Israel established together with an Arab Palestinian state. They threw both away. Because once again, having their own state was less important than not having a Jewish state. That's the bottom line. Now, in recent years, we've seen this again, whether it was Ehud Barak at Camp David or Ehud Olmert at Annapolis, Israeli leaders willing to make very strong compromises, very forthcoming proposals. Barak and Olmert both agreed to split Jerusalem. It didn't help.
Excuse
the
me.
Palestinians have not been ready for a fair compromise ever.
By the way, speaking of traitors, Ehud Olmert and Ehud, I am. Okay, you don't have to agree with me. Speaking of traitors, Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak, both of these offered everything to create a Palestinian state. And it not only backfired, it caused, in Ehud Barak's case, it caused the Second Intifada, which is the suicide bombing war, et cetera, et cetera. Today, both of those figures, instead of saying, you see, we in good faith wanted to do that, and many right-wingers were angry at us, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted to do it, and they rejected it and tried to kill us. Instead of saying that today, both of those two Ehuds have the nerve to go around the world and say that we're committing genocide and that we're an apartheid state and that this is, of all people, the ones who know on their flesh what they wrought on us by their peace overtures for a Palestinian state. So how dare they?
You can criticize them, and I think their positions are wrong, but I don't call them traitors. I think you've gone over the top. I don't like it when the left call Netanyahu a traitor. They can say they disagree with him. I think they're traitors should be kept for real traitors. I want to explain why.
Abetting the enemies. Excuse me. Is being a traitor actively abetting the enemy?
So are all the people out there saying agree to all of Hamas's demands and just pull out and that are they? No, they're wrong.
No, I said Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak, both previous prime ministers, who actually tried to implement all of this. And they, of all people, should know. They are the people who should say, look, we tried everything and it didn't work because of them. And today they're blaming us and saying that Israel is committing war crimes. How dare that? You want to tell me that's not treasonous?
Yes, I'm telling you that they're wrong. And I'm trying to find the motivation for them doing that. But I always remember Ehud Olmert took out the nuclear reactor in Syria.
Yes.
Ehud Barak was one of Israel's great warriors over the years. Yes.
So what? We're not talking about in the past.
But I'm saying you're using the T word, and I think that's over there.
They've become that way. I didn't say they always were.
I think we have to have a politics in Israel where we can disagree strongly, and I can say that I think they're wrong. But I think traitors should be saved for real traitors.
Okay, well, I actually think that they are helping the enemy. So I do. Okay, you don't have to agree with that, and it's true. I don't throw that word around lightly. No, I don't. We're in an existential war for our survival. And you have people with great authority, the authority of having been Israeli leaders, agree with the enemy that we're committing genocide.
So
Gaza-
argue with them on the content. I don't
no.
think.
This is now a moral issue.
Can I have a question?
Yes.
The term traitor has legal implications, right? If they were real traitors, they'd be taken to court and they'd be put in jail. They have positions that you disagree with, that I disagree with, but it's a different to call. I tell you what the problem with the word traitor is, because if you say someone's traitor, that theoretically you can say they should have a death sentence. That naturally follows, right? And once again, I don't like it when people say it about politicians on the right. Once again, you can say you disagree, you don't like them on this, but to use the word traitor, I think in this situation, let's be frank, people who like Ehud Barak and who like Ehud are also soldiers on the ground fighting in Gaza.
Oh, no, don't call them. No. Hold on a minute. First of all, then I will change the word. I will not say they are traitors. I'm going to say they engage in treasonous behavior. That I will say. Okay. I'm willing to modify what I said.
So I had a small victory today in the podcast.
Yes, you do. You often have a small victory. I just think that there are, there's something called disagreement, and that's right. There are arguments. I know a lot of people, we argue, etc. I argue with people who agree with me on the right. I argue with people on the left. There is a crossing of a line that I say moves into territory that is no longer an argument. It's an issue that has moral implications and consequences. And at that point, I don't consider it an argument.
So I'm repeating myself, I apologize. I had a small victory today in the podcast because you admitted that maybe I was right on an issue. And I look forward to next week when hopefully I will have another moral victory.
Or I will.
See you then.
Look forward to it.